Hi, I take coconut oil in the morning as part of 5 lifestyle changes I made as adjunctive therapy for Parkinson's disease. I am making this video because I ask people who want to try what I did to talk it over with their doctor. Most of them do that. However, their doctor often tells them that coconut oil contains saturated fat, and that stuff will kill you. So, I am making this for doctors. If you agree with these doctors who think that saturated fats cause health issues, I think you will be shocked at the findings of the largest study in history to test that idea that eating saturated fat correlates with heart disease or mortality. There is a long history of scientists linking saturated fats and butter to heart disease. These covers of Time magazine reflect the history of the debate. The first caption says Ansel Keys on the cover of Time magazine in 1961. He claimed that saturated fats in the diet clogged arteries and caused heart disease. The second caption says Time magazine cover story in 2014. Scientists were wrong about saturated fats. They don't cause heart disease after all. Let's get straight to the point and look at the largest study I know of that addresses the question of safety of saturated fat. The study is called the PURE study, which stands for the Prospective Urban-Rural Epidemiology. The study looked at 135,335 people for a median of 7.6 years in 18 countries, 5 continents. The paper was published in The Lancet in August of 2017. The study did not just find that there was no correlation between any fat consumption and heart disease. They found that increased consumption of saturated fats correlated with a reduction in relative risk of stroke. Quoting the article, high carbohydrate intake was associated with higher risk of total mortality, whereas total fat and individual types of fat were related with lower total mortality. Total fat and types of fat were not associated with cardiovascular disease, myocardial infarction, or cardiovascular disease mortality, whereas saturated fat had an inverse association with stroke. Global dietary guidelines should be reconsidered in light of these findings. You can stop watching the video now. The rest of the video just looks at trends and explains how the statistics were done. If you leave now, please consider clicking like. Let's look at the table where they show the relative risk of saturated fat. They adapted the food survey of each of the countries, adding to the food database of nutrient content, and validated their survey methods. The percentage of energy provided by saturated fat is based on the survey taken at the start of the study. The researchers ranked the population in order of the reported amount of saturated fat in their diet. Once they were in order, the population was divided into fifths, or quintiles. The lowest quintile had a median of just 2.8% of energy provided by saturated fat. Confidence intervals for that median ranged from 2% to 3.4%. The highest quintile had a median of 13.2% of energy coming from saturated fat. The confidence intervals for the highest quintile distribution around the median were from 11.9% to 15.1%. The incidence of these outcomes is given in frequency per 1,000 participants. The outcomes reported include total mortality, major cardiovascular disease, myocardial infarction or heart attack, stroke, cardiovascular disease, and non-cardiovascular disease mortality. So if we look at the data for strokes, we find that incidence 2.7 strokes per 1,000 in the first quintile that consumed a median of 2.8% of their energy as saturated fat. This is compared to the incidence of 1.3 strokes per 1,000 in the fifth quintile that consumed a median of 13.2% of their energy as saturated fat. So if we look over here at the right of this table, they switch from incidence of each outcome to comparing the hazards ratio of being in the first quintile versus any of the other 4 quintiles. So if we compare the first quintile to the fifth quintile for stroke, the hazard ratio is given as 0.79. The p-value, which just applies to the hazard ratio for the quintile 1 versus quintile 5, is 0.48. A p-value of less than 0.05 is considered significant. So what in the world is a hazard ratio? If we naively divide the incidence per 1,000 of quintile 5 of 1.3 by 2.7, which is the incidence per 1,000 of quintile 1, 1.3 divided by 2.7 is equal to 0.48. So that is not what a hazard ratio is. I have a book on survival analysis that I used when I worked at the bank. The book describes a method of determining the hazard ratio using a method defined by Cox regression. To put it simply, a hazard ratio also adjusts for all these things listed here in the bottom of the table. It says hazard ratios in 95% confidence intervals are adjusted for age, sex, education, waist-to-hip ratio, smoking, physical activity, diabetes, urban or rural location, and energy intake. Suntre was also included as a random effect, and frailty models were used. Major cardiovascular disease was equal to cardiovascular disease plus myocardial infarction plus stroke plus heart failure. So the takeaway is that even when you use fancy statistics to account for all the confounding issues I just read, there was a significant reduction in stroke associated with an increase in consuming saturated fats. The paper recommends that the guidelines for diet be reevaluated. We can look at other associations in this graph from the article. They talk about relative risk again. So the values greater than 1 on the y-axis means the risk is increased in this group more than an average risk for everyone after once again adjusting for a list of confounders. The values less than 1 show that you have a lower relative risk. To make up for the fact that reduced risk ranges from 1 to 0, while increased risk varies from 1 to infinity, they show this as a log scale that tends to shrink values greater than 1 and stretch lower risk by the same distance. Now we see that the upper charts are relative risk from all forms of mortality. The lower charts are major cardiovascular disease. They define major cardiovascular disease as major cardiovascular disease equals fatal cardiovascular disease plus myocardial infarction plus stroke plus heart failure. The first column of charts on the left is for energy from total fat. Note the trend for total fats is that when you don't eat enough fat, you are at high relative risk for both all mortality and major cardiovascular disease. Then when you get enough fat, you are at a lesser risk of all forms of mortality and major cardiovascular disease. Now let's go all the way to the right. We will skip over the 3 components that together make up total fat. That is saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated, and go to the trends for carbohydrates. The more carbohydrates you eat, the greater your relative risk from all causes of mortality or major cardiovascular disease. So if these are trends, why doesn't this paper find a correlation between carbohydrates and major cardiovascular disease? If you look back at the quintiles and hazard ratios, the p-values for the quintile 5 versus quintile 1 for major cardiovascular disease was 0.6. So we can say there is a trend, but we can't say it is statistically significant. That is a very important point. However, when we look at the quintile analysis and total mortality, we see a p-value of 0.0001 and a hazard ratio of 1.28, meaning that getting more of your energy from carbs is correlated with a higher hazard ratio for total mortality. To summarize, carbohydrate consumption was correlated with an increase in overall mortality, while both fat consumption and saturated fat consumption did not correlate with either major cardiovascular disease or overall mortality. Eating a higher percentage of saturated fat correlated with lower incidence of stroke. Once again, I put a link to this paper in the description of this video below. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you want others to see this video, or if you want to receive notifications about my channel.